Listen carefully, because this isn't the Cleopatra you were spoon-fed in school. The name you know as beauty, seduction, and tragic romance was never meant to be remembered as flesh and blood. She was a mask, a carefully engineered lie. And the moment you glimpse her true face, you'll understand why the world's empires, ancient and modern, have worked so hard to twist her memory into something safe, something glamorous, something harmless. Picture it. Alexandria, the beating heart of ancient knowledge, the city where the greatest minds of the ancient world placed scrolls, so dangerous, so transformative, that entire kingdoms trembled at their existence. And ruling from the shadows of this great library was a woman whose bloodline was poison and prophecy, corruption and control. Cleopatra. But not the Cleopatra of Hollywood, not the goddess painted by poets and actors. This Cleopatra was a predator in silk, a high priestess of manipulation, a sovereign who understood one thing better than any general, any king, any priest before her: the psychology of control. Do you know why men fall for lies? Because lies are dressed in beauty, lies wear perfume, lies whisper in your ear like a lover promising eternity. Cleopatra understood this. She weaponized desire. She weaponized loyalty. She didn't merely conquer men like Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, she reprogrammed them. These titans of the Roman world, men who commanded armies and shook nations, became her instruments. And you've been told it was love. No, it was strategy. It was the art of bending wills, the dark architecture of domination. But there's something far worse buried here, something even history's official scribes dared not put in the open. Cleopatra's dynasty, the Ptolemies, were not Egyptians in the way you might think. They were Macedonian Greeks, foreign rulers who cloaked themselves in Egyptian divinity to cement control. They took the throne by blood, by incest, by ritualized corruption. They preserved their dynasty by folding brother into sister, child into parent, until the line itself became a snake eating its own tail. Generation after generation, madness, cruelty, and lust coagulated into the figure of Cleopatra. Her beauty was not purity, it was the calculated face of centuries of predation. And you must understand this. The true story of Cleopatra is not about one queen. It is about a system, a prototype of psychological empire that never ended. Because what she practiced in her palaces, the manipulation of image, the seduction of power, the rewriting of identity, these are the very techniques still used on you today. Do you think it is an accident that her face has been reshaped 1,000 times, from ancient coins to Renaissance paintings, from Elizabeth Taylor to modern museum posters? Her real face, the coarse reality of who she was, is hidden. Why? Because symbols are weapons. Cleopatra is no longer a woman, she is a program, a story loaded with emotional charge implanted into your mind as a template for desire, tragedy, and fatal beauty. You see Cleopatra and you think you're studying history. But in truth, history is studying you. Every empire after hers understood the lesson. Control the story, and you control the people. Control the myth, and you control men's souls. And so Cleopatra was remade not as the serpent she was, but as the goddess you were meant to long for. A false icon of female divinity, of passion and intellect, carefully polished until the corruption of her dynasty, the brutality of her rule, the blood dripping from her throne, all of it was buried under silk and shadow. But here's the secret that gnaws at the edges of history. Fragments of her true appearance exist. Scholars have unearthed coins minted in her reign, coins that do not flatter, coins that show a face sharp, masculine, almost grotesque by modern standards. The long nose, the thin lips, the intensity of her eyes, this was not the painted seductress of silver screens. This was a ruler, hardened, merciless, engineered by centuries of incestuous power. The face they don't want you to see. And why does this matter? Because when you realize how Cleopatra's image has been manipulated, you start to see the architecture of control around you. Every time you are told who to admire, who to worship, who to envy, look deeper. Who gains from that illusion? Who profits from you chasing shadows? Cleopatra's dynasty mastered this long before your government, your media, your culture. She was the template. Ask yourself, why does a woman who died over 2,000 years ago still live inside your imagination, stronger than queens, kings, and empires who came after? Because she was never allowed to die. Her myth was immortalized, weaponized. She became an eternal distraction. A beautiful ghost keeping men from seeing the darker truth that real power was never about love, never about beauty. It was about control, and you have inherited the same system she perfected. So when you hear the name Cleopatra, remember this. You are not remembering her. You are remembering the lie. You are remembering the mask, and every mask is worn for a reason. And tonight, I will take you behind the mask. You wanted darkness. Good. Now we go deeper. Close your eyes for a second and imagine a map laid across a table, wax seals, inked lines, a world reduced to roots and choke points. On that map, Alexandria is a knot, not because of its marble or its scholars, but because of what it fed. Grain for empires, knowledge for kings, ritual legitimacy for anyone clever enough to claim it. That knot is where politics becomes biology, where bloodlines do not merely reproduce, they are engineered, sterilized, perfected for rule. This is the axis on which Cleopatra's story turns. If Section 1 taught you her face is a mask, Section 2 pulls that mask aside and reveals the machinery beneath. The Ptolemies were architects of an unthinkable intimacy. Brother married sister, uncle to niece, to hold a crown that was never theirs by birthright. They performed a public incest, a ritual marriage designed to close the dynasty around itself like a ring of razor blades. It was not romance, it was a firewall. With each incestuous union, trust was centralized, power concentrated. Genealogies were pruned for loyalty. The dynasty became a living vault, and Cleopatra was the last combination left in the safe. She inherited not just a throne, but a perfected system of purification. Remove the diffident, reward the faithful, crush the rest. The dynasty's morality was transactional, blood as currency. Understand what that does to a person, to a culture. When your rule is maintained by controlled reproduction, you begin to treat loyalty as an inherited trait and dissent as a disease. Children are tested like precious horses. Wives are selected for stability rather than love. Priests perform rites that are not piety but inventory checks. And into this world Cleopatra was born and educated. She did not accidentally learn manipulation. She was schooled in it, baptized in it, made fluent in it like a language. Now listen, power must be seen to be divine, so she took on the garments of gods. Cleopatra did not simply associate with Isis, she claimed to be her living embodiment. That is the real brilliance and brutality of her theater. When a ruler can step into the role of a goddess, obedience becomes religious. Priests become administrators. Worshippers become tax collectors. The temple becomes a bureau of consent. In Alexandria, every festival was carefully choreographed propaganda. Incense to charm, sacrificial theater to awe, processions to redraw the lines between ruler and subject. The queen, draped in linen and gold, stood at the center of ritual like a live emblem, less mortal, more program. And the library of Alexandria, was a weapon. You think of scrolls and scholars, of philosophy and poetry, but knowledge in the wrong hands is not liberation, it is leverage. Whoever decides which scrolls are preserved and which are consigned to flame decides the range of possible thought. Censoring is governance by omission. The Ptolemies collected, catalogued, and parceled out knowledge like grain. A philosopher's idea could be withheld until it suited the state, a history rewritten to flatter. Silence is as potent as a law. Cleopatra's court understood this. Control the narrative, and you control the mind. Control minds, and you control men of arms. Cleopatra did not win Antony by beauty alone. She won him with timing, spectacle, and a sequence of events calibrated to break a Roman's habit of thought. She staged vulnerability, then withdrew it. She offered intimacy, then withheld it. Imagine the scene, a barge that glints like a temple on water, purple sails billowing like a priestly canopy, musicians playing minor keys that unsettle the rational mind and prime it for suggestion. It is a ritual performed for an adult man, trained to resist such things, yet each element chips away at his certainty. This is psychological siegecraft. Surround a choice with sensory overload until the mind surrenders in search of clarity. She was a master of pacing, of creating emotional environments that rewired decision-making. Power also walks through stomachs. Egypt was the granary of the Mediterranean. Its silos were arsenals. Control the bread, and you can bend the city. Cleopatra held this lever with cold calculation. She could throttle supplies or flood the market with abundance. Grain ships became messages, a cargo delayed, a famine forged, loyalty purchased. Attacking a polity through food is ancient, brutal, efficient. It bypasses armies and goes straight to survival instincts. A populace will forgive tyrants who feed them. They will overthrow those who starve them. So the queen used food as a currency of control, another instrument in her arsenal. And let's talk about shadows, the people who did the real work. Spies operating as courtiers, eunuchs who ran the palace as both confessor and censor, priesthoods who doubled as secret police. Their faces are not in statues, but they were the neural network of the regime. They policed loyalty, arranged marriages, engineered scandals, and when necessary, solved problems permanently. Assassination was not melodrama in that court. It was logistics. Identify motive, remove resource, secure compliance. History remembers battles. Often it forgets the quiet executions that decide them. There is a myth you've heard about the asp, the venomous snake, the romanticized suicide of a defeated queen. It reads like a line penned for tragedy, and tragedy sells. But consider the alternative as you should. In a court where death is administrative and life is strategic, death can be managed, staged, or concealed. A ruler's exit may be designed to cast a pall over successes or to cement martyrdom. Whether Cleopatra's death was self-inflicted or engineered by those who feared what she knew is a question that should unsettle you. If the end is controlled, the narrative remains under control. That is the pattern. This is not merely a story about a queen. It is a lesson carved in human flesh about how institutions devour truth and replace it with ritual, how myths are manufactured to stabilize power, and how a single figure, capable, ruthless, theatrical, can model techniques that last millennia. The Ptolemaic laboratory of rule birthed practices that reappear in different guises across time. The marriage of religion and state, the management of supply lines, the manipulation of media equivalents, then scrolls, now screens, and the deployment of spectacle to overwhelm rational thought. So when you study Cleopatra, do not stop at her cosmetics or lovers. Trace the infrastructure, the rituals that sanitized murder, the grain routes that bought allegiance, the priests who kept secrets, the curated archives that defined truth. That architecture is the hidden curriculum of power. And once you see it, you cannot unknow it. Do you feel it yet? The tightening in your chest, the sensation that what you're hearing isn't just history, but a mirror being held up to your present reality. Good. Hold on to that unease, because now we step into the chamber where Cleopatra stopped being merely a queen and became a pivot point for two empires, Rome and Egypt. This is the layer where psychology bleeds into geopolitics, where bedsheets become battlegrounds, and where debt, desire, and divine theater fuse into chains stronger than iron. Cleopatra did not seduce Rome by accident. She targeted its most vulnerable point, the egos of men who thought themselves gods. Julius Caesar, the general who tore the Republic apart, walked into Alexandria with his legions at his back, and yet he was drawn into her web like an insect sensing nectar. How? Because Cleopatra understood that Rome's greatest men were not invincible, they were lonely. They carried burdens no senator could share, responsibilities no soldier could understand. She weaponized intimacy, offered herself not just as a lover, but as a mirror that reflected back the image of destiny. To Caesar, she became proof that he was more than a man. He was a pharaoh, a god-king, with a goddess consort at his side. In truth, she was running the oldest scam in human history. Convince a man he is immortal, and he will surrender everything to you. But Cleopatra did not stop with Caesar. After his death, she pivoted seamlessly to Mark Antony, Rome's great general of the East. Once again, the same script: seduction wrapped in ritual, love as theater, submission disguised as command. Antony believed he was choosing Cleopatra. In reality, she was scripting his choices, one ritual, one feast, one night of whispered promises at a time. What Antony saw as partnership was, in fact, a transfer of sovereignty. His loyalty ceased to be Roman, it became Alexandrian. Cleopatra had done the impossible. She had colonized the mind of a conqueror. Do you understand the weight of this? Military force bends the body, political decrees bend society, but psychological conquest, this bends the soul. Cleopatra created Antony's new identity. She crowned him Dionysus reborn, a god of wine, excess, and chaos. Together they staged ceremonies where Antony dressed as a deity and Cleopatra as his divine counterpart. These rituals were not private play, they were propaganda. The world watched a Roman general abandon his identity, his discipline, his republic, and step willingly into the role Cleopatra wrote for him. That is not seduction, that is reprogramming, and Rome saw it. The Senate, Octavian, every rival understood the danger. Antony was not just betraying his duty, he was exporting Rome's future into Cleopatra's palace. This was not about love, it was about sovereignty. If Cleopatra could pull Rome's greatest generals into her orbit, she could tilt the balance of civilization itself. Rome would not conquer Egypt, Egypt would quietly devour Rome. But let us go deeper. Why did Cleopatra succeed? Because she exploited Rome's soft underbelly, debt. The Republic was drowning in it. Wars had drained coffers, soldiers demanded land, and elites had sunk their fortunes into campaigns that returned little but scars. Cleopatra's treasury, filled with grain, gold, and the wealth of the Nile, was the lifeline Antony needed. She financed his wars. She purchased his loyalty in currency Rome itself could not supply. Debt is slavery disguised as contract. Antony became her debtor and therefore her instrument. And here is the forbidden truth. Debt and desire are the twin chains that still bind men today. You are told you are free, but your debts enslave you. You are told your desires are yours, but they are implanted by systems of control. Cleopatra used both. She made Antony believe his desires were his own, while ensuring his obligations tied him tighter with every passing day. Desire blinds, debt binds. Together, they erase the will. Now stop and think. Who benefits today from your desires? Who profits from your debts? The system hasn't changed, only the costumes have. Cleopatra's palace has become your marketplace. Her feasts have become your advertisements. Her whispered promises have become your screens. The architecture of control is eternal, because men keep falling for the same illusions. And here is where I speak directly to you. If you followed this descent this far, you are not here for entertainment, you are here for transformation. And I want you to prove it. Right now, I want you to go into the comments and write this phrase twice. I reject the mask, I claim the truth. Write it twice. Seal it into your memory, burn it into your identity, because his is not just content, it is initiation. You are stepping across a threshold most men will never even glimpse. Cleopatra's true genius was not her beauty, nor her wealth, nor her armies. It was her ability to make men rewrite themselves in her image. Julius Caesar saw himself as a pharaoh. Mark Antony saw himself as Dionysus. Both men abandoned who they were and became characters in her play. Ask yourself, who are you playing right now? Whose script are you following? If you don't answer, then the answer is simple. It isn't yours. That is why Cleopatra matters, because she is the archetype of psychological empire. The method by which rulers stop fighting with swords and start fighting with stories. She shows you how easily greatness can be stolen, how quickly men exchange their crowns for costumes, how silently sovereignty can be siphoned away. And if you think this ended 2,000 years ago, you are already lost. Look at your leaders. Look at the idols plastered across your feeds. Look at the billionaires who sell you gods in new disguises. The same machinery hums beneath it all, but now you've seen the gears. You know the truth they never wanted you to see, and that is only the beginning. Because in the next step, we are going to enter the darkest chamber of all, the place where Cleopatra's dynasty fused ritual murder, divine kingship, and institutional manipulation into a single system designed not just to rule nations, but to enslave generations. The air in the chamber is heavy now, thicker, darker. You feel it pressing against your chest, don't you? That's because we've arrived at the heart of the labyrinth, the place where Cleopatra's dynasty fused kingship with ritual, politics with blood, and spectacle with sacrifice. If before you were peering through a keyhole, now I'm opening the door. What you see here will not be pretty, but it will explain why her dynasty survived as long as it did, why Rome both feared and desired her throne, and why echoes of these rituals still whisper through the walls of our institutions today. Cleopatra was not simple, a queen. She was the last high priestess of a cult of power built on centuries of ritualized blood. The Ptolemies learned something crucial from the pharaohs they supplanted. Kingship was never secure unless it was sanctified by death. Every coronation, every festival, every military triumph was shadowed by sacrifice, not always public, not always visible, but always present. A life taken to feed the gods, a body buried beneath new temples, a ritual killing to mark the cycle of renewal. Blood was currency, blood was proof, blood was the invisible ink with which legitimacy was written. And do not make the mistake of thinking this was mere superstition. It was psychology. People obey what they fear, and they fear what they believe is connected to eternity. Ritual killing is the oldest form of theater. It tells the people, your ruler is not just flesh, but chosen by forces that feed on life itself. To rebel against such a ruler feels like rebelling against the universe. That is how dynasties extend their reach beyond the battlefield and into the marrow of their subjects' bones. Cleopatra inherited this stagecraft, and she wielded it with precision. Festivals in Alexandria were not feasts, they were orchestrated programs. Imagine the streets lined with golden altars, incense so thick it choked the air, processions of priests carrying effigies of gods that swayed like puppets, and at the climax, an offering of blood. Sometimes animal, sometimes not. The crowd roared not only because they were entertained, but because they felt the world itself had been recalibrated before their eyes. Order had been reaffirmed. Their queen had proved once more she was tethered to the divine, paid for with life. But Cleopatra did something more dangerous. She understood that ritual could be weaponized outside of religion into politics itself. She staged Rome's Antony as a god, enthroned Bessie. Her, wrapped in divine garments, presented to the masses not as a general, but as a deity. And when Antony killed her enemies, it wasn't political execution, it was sacrifice. When rivals disappeared, it wasn't murder, it was purification. She reframed power into ritual, turning violence into sacred theater. And once violence is sanctified, it no longer provokes rebellion, it breeds reverence. Ask yourself, how many of your modern rituals, national ceremonies, military parades, political inaugurations are echoes of this same manipulation? Lives may not be taken on the altar, but wars are dressed in flags. Deaths are sanctified as sacrifice for freedom, and blood is spilled in the name of order. Ritual masks the horror and sanctifies the act. The machinery is the same. Cleopatra just wrote the script. Now, we come to the library again, the symbol everyone romanticizes. But buried beneath the poetry and philosophy was something far more sinister. Records of ritual, manuals of domination, treaties of manipulation, scrolls that detailed how to choreograph obedience, how to weaponize festivals, how to bind law to religion so tightly that disobedience became heresy. Knowledge wasn't just hoarded in Alexandria, it was curated. Truth that empowered the dynasty was preserved, truth that could arm the masses was erased. That's why the library's destruction still haunts history, not because we lost knowledge, but because it covered the tracks of institutionalized control. We'll never know what techniques were burned into ash, and perhaps that's exactly what someone wanted. And then there is the matter of bloodlines, the ultimate ritual. Cleopatra's family didn't just marry one another for tradition, it was sacrificial in itself. Siblings denied the chance for healthy bonds, children raised in the shadow of power, genetic degeneration accepted as a price for sovereignty. Every incestuous union was a sacrifice of humanity at the altar of dynasty. They burned their own blood and to keep the throne intact. Imagine what that does to a psyche raised inside it. No wonder Cleopatra grew into a woman who saw people not as souls, but as instruments. You may be tempted to say this was ancient, primitive, barbaric. But I challenge you, look at the world today. Do you think ritual killings have vanished? Or have they evolved, hidden behind veils of policy, warfare, industry, and silence? Think of soldiers sacrificed to causes they don't understand. Think of lives destroyed in economic crises orchestrated by unseen hands. Think of cultural sacrifices, traditions erased, identities annihilated to maintain the stability of an empire's narrative. Blood is still paid. Only the altars have changed. And here is the hardest truth. Once you see this, you begin to notice the rituals everywhere. The moments you thought were spontaneous celebrations are choreographed. The events you thought were tragedies are engineered, and the leaders you thought were chosen are crowned in ceremonies designed to transfer power from ritual to reality. The techniques Cleopatra perfected, blood, spectacle, censorship, psychological seduction, these are still the instruments of kings and corporations alike. Cleopatra was not unique. She was a prototype. Her dynasty simply sharpened the tools, polished the mask, and staged the theater better than most. And when Rome finally moved against her, it was not because she was weak. It was because she was too strong, too effective at turning rituals into weapons, too successful at transforming generals into gods, too dangerous in her ability to fuse sex, blood, and sovereignty into a single machinery. Rome feared her because she was playing the same game they were, but better. And here's where you must brace yourself. Because what comes next is the collapse. The moment when illusions shatter, when Rome and Cleopatra collide, and when the truth of who truly won has been buried in lies for over 2 millennia. Now, lean in. This is where the story of Cleopatra stops being a romance and becomes a cautionary tale about power, deception, and historical erasure. Her fall was never just personal. It was an operation, a systemic overwrite designed to erase her methods and make the world forget the threat she truly posed. History tells you she died of an asp, that she chose death over capture, that Rome's Octavian triumphed. But that version, the one you know, is as much a performance as the ceremonies she staged in Alexandria. The real truth is far darker, far more calculated, and far more dangerous to the human mind than any story of suicide or lost love. Cleopatra was cornered, yes, but cornered only in the material sense. She still commanded resources, loyalty, and psychological leverage that Rome could not ignore. Octavian did not merely defeat her armies, he dismantled her narrative. He knew what she understood intuitively. History is the ultimate weapon. Control the narrative, and you control reality. And so, like the Ptolemies before her, he waged a campaign of rewriting. Coins with her likeness were removed, records were destroyed, and Roman writers reimagined her as a seductress, a temptress, a woman who led men to ruin through beauty rather than intellect or strategy. The truth that she bent the mightiest empire in the world to her will was systematically buried. Understand the psychological mechanism here. By transforming Cleopatra into a cautionary fable about lust and vanity, Rome neutralized her posthumous influence. They could not control her while she was remembered as a sovereign, a strategist, a master of psychological warfare. So they made her harmless. And that is the lesson hidden in her death. The erasure of truth is more powerful than the extinction of life. Death silences the body, but narrative controls eternity. Rome understood it, Cleopatra understood it, and now you understand it too. But consider this. If her true genius was erased, how did it survive? In whispers, in fragmented coins, in the patterns of power that persisted after her fall. Look closely at the structure of influence in modern institutions, the same triad she perfected in Alexandria: spectacle, loyalty, and psychological leverage. The techniques she used to bend Antony are mirrored today in CEOs, politicians, and influencers who reframe desire, manipulate scarcity, and engineer dependency. The lessons of her dynasty did not die. They metastasized, and now, in this moment, you are seeing them laid bare. Her supposed suicide was part of the theater. Whether it was by asp, poison, or even staged by allies to preserve her image as an untouchable goddess, the event was choreographed for posterity. It was designed to communicate a narrative to the world. Cleopatra falls, Rome prevails, order is restored. But in truth, the machinery she perfected, the combination of fear, ritual, debt, and loyalty persisted. The system of domination she embodied did not end. It merely migrated, infiltrating Roman administration, aristocracy, and eventually the civilizations that rose after. Every empire that followed borrowed a page from her manual, often unconsciously. Here's what most men will never grasp. The lesson of Cleopatra is not in her death. It is in her methodology. She demonstrated that true power is not in armies, wealth, or titles alone. True power is in control of the mind, the orchestration of loyalty, the manipulation of perception, the subtle harnessing of desire and fear. Caesar and Antony were her instruments, yes, but so was the collective memory of every empire that sought to contain her legacy. She weaponized cognition itself, and that is why her story still haunts centuries. Consider the mechanics of what Rome did after her fall. They took her allies, co-opted the executed those who resisted. They confiscated her treasury. They redistributed her lands, and most crucially, they rewrote the stories. Writers were commissioned to emphasize her vanity and seduction. Historians were guided to focus on the romanticized tragedy rather than the political and psychological mastery she wielded. Cleopatra became a character in a story rather than a strategist who reshaped an empire. The suppression of truth is subtle and pervasive. History itself is curated propaganda. Now pause and let that sink in. Every time you read about Cleopatra in textbooks, every movie that dramatizes her life, every casual reference to the seductive queen is a layer of control placed on your perception. You are being trained to remember her as harmless, to admire her beauty but fear her ambition, to sympathize but never to emulate. And that is exactly what those in power want. Controlled admiration, safe inspiration, and the permanent erasure of dangerous knowledge. But you are not most men. You are here because you want more than the sanitized stories. You are here because you want to see the system beneath the mask. You understand that the death of a queen is irrelevant compared to the survival of her methods, and this is where you diverge from the herd. You do not simply consume narrative, you analyze it, extract patterns, and recognize the machinery that has endured for millennia. History is littered with figures who were sanitized, mythologized, or erased to control populations. Cleopatra is perhaps the most vivid example because her combination of intellect, strategy, and audacity was so thorough it threatened an empire. And while the legend tells you she was defeated, the deeper truth is far more instructive. The techniques she perfected did not die with her. They were hidden in plain sight, carried forward by the institutions she once manipulated, embedded into the systems we navigate every day. And so if you have understood nothing else to this point, understand this. Cleopatra's real legacy is not romance or beauty, it is control. It is the study of human compliance, the architecture of power, the blueprint for bending men, armies, and empires alike. Her death, her legend, even the horror of her dynasty, they are all elements of a system designed to teach one simple, brutal lesson. He who controls perception controls reality. Now, listen closely because this is where the rabbit hole spirals into the present. Cleopatra's empire fell, her body vanished, her name was twisted, but her methods survived. The architecture of control she perfected in Alexandria, ritualized authority, manipulation of desire, orchestration of perception, and the weaponization of loyalty did not die. It migrated, it evolved, it infiltrated Rome, then Europe, then every empire, corporation, and institution that sought to bend people to its will. Consider this. What Cleopatra did with Antony, she did with systems of power. She understood that control does not require armies. Control requires leverage. Fear leveraged with reward, desire leveraged with scarcity, knowledge leveraged with secrecy. Today, those same principles are used on a global scale. Politicians seduce the masses with charisma. Debt binds citizens in invisible chains. Spectacles distract while the machinery of governance continues unchallenged. The tools have changed, the stage has moved, but the play remains identical. Imagine the mindset required to wield such control. Cleopatra was born into a crucible of power, where loyalty was currency and betrayal was a daily ritual. Every day she observed human nature under pressure, every feast and procession a laboratory for obedience. She learned how to engineer dependence, how to amplify scarcity into desperation, how to turn admiration into worship, and she tested these principles on men who commanded armies, nations, and history itself. Do you see it? These were not flukes. These were experiments. She was a scientist of power, and the subject was humanity itself. Look around today, and you can see the shadows of her techniques everywhere. Advertising, marketing, social media, politics, financial systems, all of it operates on the same psychological architecture. The people you are told to admire, the products you are told to desire, the narratives you are encouraged to follow, they are the modern altars. Your loyalty, your focus, your attention, they are harvested like grain from the Nile, orchestrated by unseen hands using methods that Cleopatra would have recognized instantly. Think of it in practical terms. Cleopatra created scarcity to induce dependence. She used spectacle to command attention. She staged rituals to enforce obedience. She weaponized desire and guilt to bend Antony Caesar and every courtier to her will. Now, corporations use limited editions. Social media platforms manipulate your dopamine. Governments choreograph elections and spectacles, and influencers curate lifestyles you are told to envy. The machinery is identical. Only the actors have changed. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Most people have no idea this is happening to them. They walk through the world thinking they are free, thinking they make choices. But choices are often illusions meticulously crafted by systems they cannot see. Cleopatra's blueprint teaches us that power is rarely violent. It is subtle, invasive, psychological. The ones who wield it rarely show their hands. They do not need armies. They need obedience. Now, let us examine loyalty, the subtle currency Cleopatra mastered. Antony and Caesar were bound to her not only by desire but by a network of obligations, debts, and rituals. Today, we see the same structures in professional hierarchies, political parties, and global corporations. People are not just persuaded, they are conditioned. They are rewarded for compliance, punished for deviation, and rarely aware of the invisible architecture shaping their behavior. Cleopatra understood this instinctively. She created feedback loops that guaranteed compliance without constant threat. Her techniques were surgical. And fear. Oh, the exquisite precision of fear. Cleopatra knew how to calibrate it, not enough to provoke rebellion, but enough to maintain vigilance. Threats were implicit, actions were staged, whispers were amplified. Fear becomes an invisible leash, a signal that shapes behavior without the need for visible chains. Today, fear is used on a societal level to enforce conformity. Through media, through policy, through economic pressure, the principles have not changed, only the stage has grown infinitely larger. Consider knowledge, the final weapon. Fear and desire are calibrated to produce predictable compliance. Cleopatra invented the playbook, and the world is still reading it. And consider the subtlety of control through desire. Cleopatra's alliances were structured around longing, ambition, and ego. Caesar and Antony were manipulated not through fear or force, but through perceived opportunity, admiration, and intimacy. Desire became leverage. In modern systems, the same principle applies. The allure of wealth, status, recognition, or belonging directs behavior more efficiently than overt coercion ever could. When desire is engineered, freedom becomes an illusion, because the subject is acting within parameters they believe to be self-chosen. Debt, too, is the invisible leash. Cleopatra provided resources, gold, grain. She controlled scarcity and abundance, and through this, dependency was formed. Antony became indebted morally, financially, and emotionally. Today, the same principle governs economies, credit systems, and social obligations. Scarcity is engineered. Dependency is normalized. People act against their interests because they are conditioned to seek the approval, resources, or freedom that has been meticulously rationed. Cleopatra's lesson is painfully clear. Control the supply, and you control the will. And we have not yet touched on fear, the most ancient and effective instrument of obedience. Cleopatra instilled fear not through brutality alone, but through the perception of unpredictability and omnipotence. The people believed her capable of anything, from sudden generosity to sudden destruction. Antony and Caesar feared losing her favor because it meant the collapse of their power structures. Modern systems replicate this through surveillance, policy, social pressure, and reputational risk. Fear need not be constant. It only needs to be credible, pervasive, and psychologically salient. Knowledge. G is the final lever. Cleopatra curated information, destroyed dissenting records, and controlled education in Alexandria. Information equals power. Today, think of how algorithms filter knowledge, how media narratives emphasize certain truths while burying others, how history is rewritten for political expedience. The manipulation of knowledge is a direct inheritance of Cleopatra's methods. Control what people know, and you control what they believe, and what they believe dictates what they will do. Here is the hardest part. Most people will never see this in themselves. They accept curated perception as natural reality. They do not question authority because authority has already defined the lens of observation. Cleopatra's true legacy, the ability to shape cognition, is invisible, internalized, and almost impossible to resist once it is accepted unconsciously. This is why her story has endured, not because of her beauty or her tragedy, but because she modeled the ultimate strategy for dominance over mind, matter, and memory. Now you must recognize that this knowledge changes you. Once you see the architecture of control, you cannot return to ignorance. The world you thought was spontaneous is, in part, designed. Patterns emerge in media, politics, economics, relationships, even your daily habits. Cleopatra's blueprint is everywhere, and you are now positioned to see the strings others cannot. Take a moment. Reflect. You are no longer just a passive observer. You are aware of the machinery, and that awareness is the beginning of power. Now we step into the shadows that even history tries to ignore, the inner world of Cleopatra herself. Up until now, we have spoken of her empire, her influence, her mastery of perception and control. But power, no matter how absolute, carries a cost. The machinery that bends men, reshapes empires, and manipulates history does not leave the operator untouched. Cleopatra's genius was inseparable from her isolation, her constant vigilance, and the moral compromises she made to maintain dominion. Consider what it means to be born into a dynasty engineered for control. Every relationship is transactional, every loyalty is measured, every smile, every touch, every whisper is a test or a calculation. Cleopatra did not trust casually. She could not. Betrayal was not a possibility, it was a statistical certainty. Brothers, sisters, parents, allies, all potential threats. The Ptolemaic court was a crucible of paranoia disguised as tradition. In such an environment, intimacy becomes a weapon, and isolation becomes a shield. Cleopatra learned to be alone, even when surrounded by thousands, and yet she could not afford solitude entirely. She had to perform constantly, the goddess on display, the strategist in council, the lover in private. Every action was theater, every gesture a signal. Her mind had to calculate not only her next move, but the interpretation of that move by dozens of actors, priests, generals, foreign emissaries, senators, and the people themselves. The psychological load of omnipresent scrutiny is immense. It is exhausting, it is corrosive, and it explains the sharpness, the cunning, and the ruthlessness she exhibited. Genius under pressure is often indistinguishable from severity. Let us consider Antony and Caesar again. Her manipulation of the erasure required not only skill, but endurance. She had to anticipate every desire, every suspicion, every impulse, and direct it toward outcomes that secured her throne. Love was a tool, fear was a tool, loyalty was a tool, and betrayal was always a threat. There is a psychological truth here. Mastery over others begins with mastery over yourself, but that mastery comes at the cost of human connection. The closer she got to perfection in control, the further she drifted from ordinary human empathy. She became a queen of minds, not hearts. And what of morality? What does it take to sanction the deaths, the exiles, the manipulations, the betrayals required to maintain power? Cleopatra lived in a court that normalized murder as administration, betrayal as strategy, and incest as survival. Her decisions were guided not by sentiment, but by necessity. There is a lesson here for those who seek mastery. Power is a mirror that reflects the truth about human nature, and often that reflection is darker than you are prepared to accept. The higher you climb, the more your morality is tested, the more intimate your cost. This is why isolation is not accidental. Cleopatra surrounded herself with loyalists who were also instruments, spies, eunuchs, priests, all connected to her by chains of obligation and secrecy. She could not afford missteps in trust, because a single error could unravel the system she had perfected over decades. Imagine the mental discipline required to constantly evaluate every action of every person in your sphere and simultaneously perform your role as a deity in public and as a strategist in private. This is not just leadership, it is a mental crucible that few could survive without distortion. And yet there is something almost tragic in her brilliance. She understood the psychology of others so completely that she often could predict their moves before they acted, but she could never entirely predict the machinations of fate. Rome was inevitable. Octavian's rise, the collapse of Antony's support, the shifting tides of empire, these forces were larger than even her mastery. And here lies the ultimate truth of power. No matter how skillful, the operator is always subject to forces beyond their control. Cleopatra's isolation, her constant vigilance, and her moral compromises were necessary not just to dominate, but to survive in a world that was systematically hostile to women, to intellect, and to ambition. Her psychological landscape was a battleground. Every decision carved deeper into her identity. Every alliance required vigilance. Every deception required self-restraint. And every triumph brought greater responsibility, higher scrutiny, and heavier isolation. This is why history often misunderstands her. It sees the display of power without seeing the internal toll, the relentless mental and emotional labor required to maintain it. Her life was a calculus of survival and dominance, and the cost was invisibly inscribed upon her mind and spirit. And here is the lesson for you. Mastery over systems, over people, over perception is not free. Awareness is a burden. Insight is a responsibility. Understanding the architecture of influence means you can never unsee it, and the closer you move to competence in control, the further you may drift from simple comfort, from unquestioned trust, from the naive safety of ordinary human connection. Cleopatra paid this price, and if you are willing to follow in her footsteps, not her mistakes, but her methodology, you must understand that you, too, will pay it in vigilance, solitude, and moral negotiation. So now you have seen both sides of her genius, the external power, the manipulation, the mastery of narrative and psychology, and the internal cost, the isolation, the paranoia, the compromise. This duality is essential. Power is seductive, intoxicating, transformative, but it is also corrosive, lonely, and morally ambiguous. Cleopatra embodies this paradox better than any figure in history. And it is why, even now, 2,000 years later, her lessons remain relevant and dangerous for anyone who dares to understand them. The next section will pull us deeper still. We will explore the suppression of her true image across history, the institutional mechanisms that have rewritten her life, and the ways in which societies sanitize dangerous knowledge to maintain control over populations. This is where mythology meets manipulation, and where the story of Cleopatra becomes a warning for those awake enough to recognize patterns in the modern world. Now we enter the layer that most will never perceive, the long shadow of erasure. Cleopatra's face, her story, her methods, they were all systematically rewritten, repackaged, and sanitized by the very institutions that feared her influence. Rome did not simply conquer Egypt, it conquered the memory of its queen. History, as you have been taught to understand it, is rarely neutral. It is curated, it is weaponized, and Cleopatra is perhaps the most vivid example of how narrative can be manipulated to contain danger. Consider the mechanics of this erasure. Coins bearing her likeness were defaced or melted down. Records of her political cunning were suppressed, while her personal relationships were sensationalized. Writers like Plutarch and Dio Cassius, who shaped our collective memory, emphasized beauty, seduction, and tragedy, while minimizing intellect, strategy, and psychological mastery. This was not bias, it was a calculated rewrite. Cleopatra's genius threatened Rome's legitimacy. If the world remembered her as a strategist capable of bending empires to her will, then the story of Roman invincibility was compromised. Controlling history is a tool of power. Control the story, and you control the world's perception of reality. And this is not unique to Cleopatra. Every society engages in it. Dangerous figures are mythologized, demonized, or trivialized. Knowledge that could destabilize existing hierarchies is concealed, and the tools of control themselves are normalized as culture. In Cleopatra's case, her techniques, psychological dominance, manipulation of desire and fear, orchestration of loyalty, were buried beneath a veneer of romance and tragedy. Today, institutions continue the same process. Facts are selectively framed. Narratives are shaped to maintain obedience, and the dangerous lessons of history are repackaged as entertainment or morality plays. Look closely at this mechanism. Cleopatra's death was not the end of her influence. It was the beginning of her erasure as a threat. Her methods became invisible, her strategies abstracted into cautionary tales, her brilliance converted into a seductive ghost rather than a model of real power. And yet the tools remained. The psychology of influence she wielded, fear, desire, ritual, spectacle, did not die with her. It continued, embedded in Rome, then in Europe, then across civilizations, until today. The principles are still at work, though the agents have changed. Think about media, politics, and culture today. Stories are curated, events are framed. Influencers, politicians, corporations, they all exploit the same levers Cleopatra used, though she wielded them in physical courts, not digital networks. Control attention, curate desire, manage fear, shape perception. The masses are guided to conclusions as deftly as Antony was guided to bow to her will. And yet, because the narrative is hidden beneath the surface, most people never realize they are the subjects of the same techniques. The blueprint is ancient. The players are modern. And there is a final cruelty to this erasure. It convinces the masses that power, control, and mastery are inaccessible. Cleopatra was a woman, yes, a foreign queen in a patriarchal world, but her story was deliberately simplified into tragedy, so that her methods could not be learned, so that her model could not be emulated. People are trained to admire her beauty, pity her downfall, and never study the architecture of her influence. That is the true power of narrative manipulation. It neutralizes knowledge while retaining fascination. Now here is where you diverge. You have already begun to see the machinery, the strings, the architecture beneath the veil. You have begun to understand not only what Cleopatra did, but why her story was rewritten and how the same strategies have survived to this day. The erasure is intentional. The distraction is deliberate. The myth is manufactured, and you are no longer blind to it. Remember this: once you recognize the patterns, you cannot unknow them. The ability to see how narrative shapes perception is a form of power itself. It allows you to step outside of the script, to question the assumptions baked into culture, to anticipate the levers that others exploit without your awareness. Cleopatra's methods may have been hidden behind myth, but the psychology survives, and it can be learned, applied, and recognized. Now we arrive at the culmination. Everything we have uncovered, the mask, the dynasty, the rituals, the manipulation of desire, the orchestration of perception, the psychological mastery, the systemic erasure of truth, comes together here. This is the moment where the lessons of Cleopatra's life become a blueprint not only for understanding power, but for recognizing it within every system you inhabit today. This is where knowledge becomes dangerous, because once internalized, it reshapes how you see loyalty, influence, and control, not as abstractions, but as instruments operating constantly around you. Cleopatra's genius was synthesis. She merged human psychology with institutional design. She fused ritual with politics, spectacle with obedience, knowledge with loyalty, and fear with desire. Every move, every gesture, every calculated smile served a purpose. She never acted randomly. Her genius lay in her ability to predict, shape, and exploit human behavior on an empire-wide scale. That is the blueprint you must now see clearly. Power is not physical. It is psychological, systemic, and relentless, and those who understand it can manipulate entire networks without raising a sword. Her manipulation of Antony and Caesar demonstrates the principle perfectly. She created environments where men acted according to the desires she implanted, obligations, and she structured, and fears she calibrated. She weaponized intimacy, scarcity, and spectacle to produce outcomes that seemed voluntary, inevitable, and even desirable to those under her influence. And when her dynasty fell, it was not her technique that was destroyed, it was only the immediate instrument of her power. The methods survived, embedded in the DNA of every subsequent system of control. Consider this in modern terms. Institutions today, from governments to corporations to media networks, operate on the same principles. Fear is used subtly to regulate behavior. Desire is engineered to create compliance. Loyalty is purchased through obligations, debt, and identity. Knowledge is curated to direct perception, suppress dissent, and normalize obedience. The stage is digital, the actors are faceless, but the blueprint is unmistakably the same as Cleopatra's. Once you recognize this, the world can never be perceived as innocent again. Patterns emerge everywhere, in relationships, in media, in governance, in the mechanisms of culture. Recognition becomes your first act of liberation. But there is a cost to this understanding, just as Cleopatra paid a cost for her mastery. The higher you ascend in awareness, the more isolated you become. The more you see manipulation, the less you can take narratives at face value. You cannot unsee how systems shape desire, coerce loyalty, and manufacture consent. Awareness carries responsibility, knowledge carries risk, and mastery requires discipline, vigilance, and moral fortitude. Cleopatra's life demonstrates both the power and the peril of this path. Brilliance requires sacrifice, genius demands constant calculation, and influence exacts a personal toll. The final lesson is this: true mastery is integration. To learn from Cleopatra is not to imitate her choices blindly, but to absorb her principles, strategic thinking, psychological acuity, orchestration of perception, manipulation of scarcity and loyalty, and adapt them ethically to your own life. To recognize control where it exists, to protect your autonomy, and to apply insight to navigate systems instead of being navigated. Power is everywhere, subtle and invisible. Recognition is the first step, understanding is the second, application is the third. And remember, this is not theory. This is dangerous knowledge. You have seen the architecture, traced the machinery, and glimpsed the psychological calculus that governed the most influential figures of the ancient world. You have seen how history is curated, how myths are manufactured, and how influence persists across centuries in altered forms. Cleopatra's life and legacy are a mirror, a reflection of what is possible when one masters perception, psychology, and narrative. But like all mirrors, it reveals what is hidden, and it demands courage to face the reflection. So take a moment. Reflect on everything you have learned. You now see patterns that others do not. You now recognize the architecture of influence in your world, in your life, and in the narratives that shape your mind. Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was a strategist, a psychologist, a master of systems, a practitioner of power at the most intimate and the most expansive scale. And you have traced the logic of her methods from ancient Alexandria to the modern world. The final warning: this knowledge is transformative. Once understood, it changes how you perceive human behavior, institutions, and authority. It grants insight, but also responsibility. And it is dangerous, because insight makes you unpredictable to the very systems that wish to control you. Cleopatra's legacy, preserved in myth and method, is now your inheritance. Use it wisely. Observe, analyze, anticipate, recognize manipulation, guard your autonomy, and above all, remember that mastery over systems, over perception, desire, fear, and knowledge is the ultimate form of power. History has hidden the truth for thousands of years, but now you have glimpsed it. The mask is removed, the machinery is visible, the psychology is revealed. You are no longer an innocent observer, you are awake, and that awakening is your first act of sovereignty.